disruptions. This bourbon was for you guys at the end, but I'm gonna need it now because that was a little more stress for right now than I was wanting.
That's the you drink protocol, right?
This is the you drink protocol. Okay. Well, we're behind, but the slides are loading in very slow on the shitty Wi-Fi, so I need to talk slow, but also catch up. So we'll figure that out. Huh? I wish. Then it would work.
So you're doing this EDR style?
Yes. This talk will also be a piece of snake oil. Right. Yeah, right. There's no burying the lead here. A friend of mine who's not here today says that too many hacker presentations are all for foreplay and take too long to get to the fucking. So I guess we're just going to skip over that. The fucking, yeah. So at DEF CON last year, myself and David Mitchell, we did a bunch of stuff on containers and Kubernetes. And I got really interested in a couple of pieces of Linux technology after that, namely eBPF, which I'll explain what that is in a second. And I spent a little bit of time doing the tech behind this, and now I use it all the time. It's just kind of like part of my workflow. So I'm going to be focusing primarily on Linux malware and speaking a little bit about Mac malware. The place I work at doesn't use a lot of Windows machines, so I get the good and the bad of all of that. We have some malware in this pres that I wrote. It's a Slack-based C2, so it uses Slack workspaces to do the needfuls, which is as good as any other way of doing that. So I'm going to start out just with some very basic problem setting stuff because, we have a lot of new people in the room. So bear with us while we get through that if you're all of the professionals in the front couple of rows staring me down. Yeah, we'll do our crash course. We will make all the machine learning engineers cry. And we have a phone number there for some people that we can call and ask if we have hate mail or questions. Yeah. We'll call them again. I'm sure they're still at work. Huh? They left me a lovely voicemail. I'll play it at the end for you. Okay. The disclosure of this is a bit different than other disclosures. I'm not an ML engineer. I'm not a systems engineer. I'm not... You get the idea. Yeah. Okay. So for this, I'm talking about beaconing malware. So I know there's some people in the room. This is their first conference. Welcome. If it's at your first conference, please come up with a cup, have a drink on me. Right now. That's you. In particular, yeah, it's your first conference.
All of a sudden.
Yeah, come on up. Come on. Yeah. I don't have very many cups. You're going to have to go outside. All right.
Gentlemen, thank you, sir.
All righty. Cheers. Welcome to the con. So, you guys especially need to pay attention to this bit, though, because this is very poorly timed. Yeah, have a shot, listen to this. So, what we're talking about with beaconing malware is malware that communicates with my computer over the internet. So it's like I'm on your computer without being there, right? So that's when people are talking about implants or they're talking about C2s. They're referring to this kind of architecture where a hacker gets on your computer and then they control it from somewhere else. And so that's what we're trying to do. And the technologies that we're talking about, EDRs, they're like antiviruses. Those are the things that try and stop this from happening. But what they really are is a way of taking money from over here and putting it there. Yeah. Yeah. So the antivirus system, namely like Crowdstrike or SentinelOne, they try and look at the malwares that come onto your machine and figure out whether that's like they let it go or they quarantine it or what to do with it. So they make decisions often on the fly about what to do with a file. And they can stop it from executing, or they can send someone an alarm and say like, hey, don't let that happen, it's bad, or please come help me, hacking's happening. The problem with them, and why this talk is a thing, is that these systems are proprietary and they're full of secrets. I don't know how they work. I don't work at those places for many reasons. I'm sure that they would say no. So we have to figure out what they know through different techniques. Like many people in this room, one who I'm making beautiful eye contact with right now, and I will never stop making eye contact with you, Cicero. They just know how all of these things work because they've been doing it for so long and they just have that magic touch. Such a magic touch. But I have to do it a little differently for a few reasons. I don't want to get caught by these systems, right? I want my thing to be a success. I only want to be caught sometimes if that's like what the mission or the operation calls for. But most of the time, I would prefer not to be caught because maybe I'm doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. So in this situation, my work has provided me a box that has the antivirus on it, and I would prefer not to carry around 3 laptops with me anymore, so I do all my development on one machine, and it's just the corporate machine that has the antivirus system on it. So I figured why not take the most of that and really try and instrument what the antivirus is doing. So I want to know what the antivirus, the EDR, is getting upset about, but I don't have access to its code, its console, the rule set. I just have the bits of knowledge I've picked up along the way from listening to other people or mistakes I've made or ops that have been happening in the past. But using eBPF, I can try and learn more about the behavior of the antivirus system without any of those other things. So what is eBPF? It stands for eBPF. Got him. I got him. It's the extended Berkeley packet filter. So the Berkeley packet filter, for anyone who has used Wireshark before, you've used the Berkeley packet filter before. What they did is they took the concept of extremely detailed network tracing and logging and then thought, what if we had that for everything a computer does? And so then they made it, and now it's a thing. So imagine you're using Wireshark to like analyze port 22 traffic on an IP with a certain protocol doing blah, blah, blah. Imagine just doing that, but for like anything you want that a computer could be doing with disks, with memory, with system calls, and so on. It works off system hooks, just like the Berkeley packet filter. So it works in a reactionary capacity. Something's happening or has just happened, and then it can take steps about it. It's a very, very cool monitoring tool. David and I have been using it a lot for monitoring, and it's a very foolproof way of doing detections because it's analyzing the raw system calls. Like it's pretty hard to work around the fact that like those things happen, and there's only like 100 and something of them. So the alternative before eBPF existed, it came into play in about 2014, was to make Linux kernel modules, which no one does. It's really, really hard, really expensive and time-consuming. Most businesses would just say like not support Linux or like not exist as a thing because doing that is really hard with a very long time frame because it takes forever to get a kernel module published. So they made eBPF so that you don't have to do that you can just write a thing and deploy it on a machine and it just works without having to like, join open source mailing lists and other things that can be time consuming and tedious. In other words, it's monitoring the kernel of the computer. For the people who came up and had a drink, the kernel of the computer is like the kitchen in a restaurant. You want to know what's going on in the kitchen, like did the chef spice the food a certain way, or like when did a thing go in the oven, the hardware of the computer, but you can't go back there and find out. You can either take someone else's word for it, that's like, a user space program, you can take their word for it, but maybe you send your own chef back in the kitchen and he figures it out for you and comes back and tells you like what the story is. So you get that low-level visibility, and it happens safely, it follows all of the food safety rules and so on, and everyone has a good time. It's been described that this is a bit like when the web got JavaScript and the internet became like much higher fidelity and you could do more interesting things with pages. So when we do this, we add our own observing chef to the kernel. And the eBPF tooling helps us do this safely. It compiles all our things for us and checks to make sure it won't crash the computer when it runs. And when you go through its basically little software development pipeline, it gives you really great feedback when you've made mistakes. I can personally vouch for the feedback. It's great. I make a lot of mistakes. But I didn't crash my computer once. So, though something's wrong with it because it won't display HDMI apparently. So there's that. So you can also use this same technology not to just monitor things like how we're doing in this, or how EDRs also monitor things now, but you can also use it to write malware too. And boy, can you write some fancy malware with eBPF. So using a Python BCC package, I went ahead and made myself some code. And what it does is how would we describe this? What I'm doing is I'm going to go and I'm going to look at all of the system calls that are being made by a specific process, namely Crowdstrike. And I'm going to have a list of all the Crowdstrikes it makes, all the system calls it makes all the time for as long as I feel like catching that information. Call it an hour, call it 2 hours. That's a lot of data, and it comes in really, really fast. So this system call tracing, we started off monitoring system enter events. Now, that means anytime a system call is executed, we get it, like the eBPF program, it jots that down in its little database. And after a period of time, it takes the collections of those and it sends it back out to me in the user space to collect and do something with. I started off with just catching the system calls and not the associated arguments because it kept breaking and it was very difficult. What that meant was I could see that something was making a system call, but I would have to make inferences about the specific arguments, which in the context of malware is really easy to do. But for other things, it can be a bit hard to do that bit of guesswork. So I've been fixing that up. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we need to know not just what system calls are being executed, but we need to know how often that happens. Because the working assumption is that the EDR is making a lot of system calls all the time. Many of them are the same ones over and over again. And it's also opening network connections pretty regularly, right? It's phoning home, it's looking for definition updates, it's checking in with the console, it's giving health metrics. So what we need to do is we need to make something called a histogram, which is a science word for a comma-separated values file that we have a computer science fancy person in the front row, and he's getting a real kick out of that one. I'm glad. And so it basically gives us the system call and the count, and it does this every 100 milliseconds. So if Crowdstrike gets excited and it does more of the same thing, I will know the difference between just regular behavior. So now we do machine learning because we have a lot of data. So we do some learning. What we do is we need to populate that histogram with the information of what Crowdstrike's been up to. So what we do is we tell the little script, this is the process that holds Crowdstrike. Please use our little eBPF tool to capture all of the system calls that it's making and write them to our CSV file. So this is the learning phase, the learning phase where we capture the data. I do not run malware during this phase. I just do normal things on the computer. Commit some code or, run a test with Bazel or, whatever you do for software development. So now I have a baseline of what the EDR does when there's nothing bad happening on the machine. In this demo, I do this for about 45 minutes to an hour, so I get like a pretty solid baseline. And there's no reason why you just couldn't keep going, but who would ever do anything more than 45 minutes? Okay. So now we need to help the system learn. We're going to use an unsupervised learning technique here. I also like unsupervised learning and just generally being unsupervised. Shocking. Okay. Thanks, Tom. This is going a lot better than my last talk, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I didn't have a belly full of spicy chicken and too much liquor. Yeah. Ramen this time. Yeah. So, autoencoders, you hear this term a lot now in machine learning if you've been playing with ChatGPT and those kinds of things. There is a component of its training that also relies on autoencoding. The main idea with autoencoding is that we need to take our big CSV and we need to shrink it into something smaller. But we need to make sure that the meaning of the data set when we shrink it doesn't change. When we run data through a histogram, so through an autoencoder, it seems about roughly halve in size. What that means is, since it's smaller, it runs faster, and it means you can collect more data and still run it on the same shitty computer without having to go rent or buy something better. Because there's upper bounds to all of that kind of crap. So when we train a model, what we're doing at this point is we take our compressed values of the thing and then we run a series of checks to make sure that it didn't change too much in terms of its intended meaning. And I have a visualization of this in a moment. And we end up with a reference error threshold. All that really means is that the difference between the compressed and uncompressed versions is tiny. And that's a good thing. Because, if you've compressed a thing and you're trying to do math and analysis on it and it doesn't mean what it meant before, it's not particularly useful. At this point, we have a model, right? And you hear this term a lot now. That's the basics of making a pretty shitty model. In the validation loss, what we are doing mathematically is trying to make sure that the meaning or intent of the thing didn't change. So you can see in this image that we have the uncompressed version or the original file on one side and then the reconstructed one on the other side. And I think most people would agree that they kind of still, the meaning is still being conveyed, that it's the same thing. Now you can run into all kinds of really interesting machine learning attacks because those two files, in terms of if you strip away everything and look at that as a computer would, there's a lot of differences there, and a computer may classify the image on the right as a tractor, right? But that's probably a separate talk for a separate time. But this validation training is an extremely important part of machine learning and machine learning security. So expect to be hearing a lot more about this all the time forever now. So now we have a model that is an accurate representation of what Crowdstrike does under normal circumstances in an average hour Well, not an average hour, because in that hour I actually did quite a lot of, things that I wouldn't normally do in an hour. Okay. So what we do now is we run a piece of malware on the machine, or we execute components of the malicious code that we're building, and we just see if there's any change or any anomaly detection in the EDR's behavior. So in this case, we're running the Slack C2. What I'm hoping to see here is no spikes in things related to sandboxing, or an enormous amount of sockets opening because of things screaming for help. My expectation, though, is that this binary has the mark of the web. It has no obfuscation. It's not packed. So we're kind of giving it a good chance, maybe, to get detected, that is. When you're working with custom developed malware, a lot of the typical rules of working with malware, I think, change a little bit for many types of engagements. Adding additional uniqueness through encryption or obfuscation or packing and so on is probably not really a good idea, because those things work kind of well on commodity malware that's like signatured out the wazoo and running strings on it will tell you that it's Sliver or tell you that it's Crowdstrike. But if you've written it yourself, you're actually better off just writing it and then not touching it. So in the looping video here, we start the implant and then we switch over and we monitor what anomalies we pick up. The first one that we're going to notice is MMAP, which is it's mapping memory regions into its address space, and it's looking for potential threats, and it's scanning for specific patterns that look like malware or viruses. We then see it use lseek, which my hunch is, in this case, is that it's looking at different sections of the file and jumping around to parts that it has been told to check. It then checks access, so it's looking to see if there are any interesting permissions that are associated with this that may harm the system when it executes. It does some symlink stuff with read links. We can skip over that. But probably the most interesting one is FNCTL. It is actually performing a very brief sandbox of the executing binary. And how would you describe that? You would say it's checking the file descriptors, and it's looking for interesting file locks or sign that there's been some manipulation. So the question is, why did it get really interested in this particular file in the first place and decide to briefly quarantine it and skip over and look for interesting things in memory? Digging in a bit through some of these specific calls, I know that we are dealing with a unique binary, obviously, and we see from some of the system calls that it seems to be primarily performing ransomware-related checks. So if I show you in the next screen, you'll see this, but it's checking to see if the thing is packed. And then it's very interested to see if there are any in-memory encryption things happening, like encryption or decryption actions, which it doesn't, which I think is why it let it go. And so in the next slide, we poke it with a stick until it gets mad. And these are the things that did actually make it mad. An interesting thing to note is I took the exact same binary and detonated it on Mac, and everything was fine. I then packed this binary and executed it on Linux. Everything was fine. And then on Mac, it didn't work, and then they fixed that bug, and then it resulted in a detection. So there's quite different behavior, even with the same binary generated by Golang, like from the same C2 framework across Linux and Mac. So in short, performing in-memory decryption or encryption actions gets the EDR very excited. Packing, quite risky on Linux and Mac at the moment. In general, ransomware-related TTPs resulted in extended quarantines or failure to execute, where it would just like block the binary from executing. Outside of this, if I change the rate of network connections, as in like the beaconing behavior, I notice no difference. No matter how fast or slow I modified the network activity, it didn't seem to make any difference in the behavior of the EDR. So in short, most of the detections had to do with the ransomware TTPs. And I've noticed in recent times that ransomware gangs have changed their behavior and are often now just like not encrypting customer files. They just extort them for their data, or extort them and then extort their customers. And I wonder if this behavior has anything to do with it, or if it's just, for them, it's just a complete waste of time. So, anytime I'm working on developing a technique or a piece of malware, I run these scripts on my machine, just in the background, and then I check them periodically and just see if the EDR has gotten excited by anything that I've done. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a detection on the other side. It might be that you're just not quite hitting that threshold of activity to result in a detection, but it certainly is giving you like immediate feedback that, hey, you're headed in the wrong direction with this, or you're headed in the right direction with this. And I found that very useful to get some like test-driven feedback related to detections. The team I'm on is very small, so we don't get to run like a shitload of operations, and I'm not consulting anymore, so you're not getting that like constant testing, constant feedback. And so this has been a great way to keep up with changes in EDR behavior without having to like be consulting or doing a shitload of tests all the time. I want to just briefly cover some of the other things that you can do with exactly this kind of tooling or something very similar. Oh yeah, it's not a party. What's wrong, Ed?
That's very funny.
Okay. Okay. Can you recover and compose yourself? Because you're very distracting. You're good. So, what we've got here is basically the bones of our own EDR by accident, right? Because it's looking at the system behavior of a particular process, and I'm using that to make decisions, which is kind of like, the embryo of the whole thing. So, one thing I've been working on is we have really extensive test suites that happen when we run code at build time to push to prod. If I run those test suites while catching all of the system calls, I then have a baseline of our application behavior and can use that to guide and steer different baseline decisions for like AppArmor profiles or SecComp profiles and so on. Or you could just build something entirely to do that. There's an open source tool from Aquasec called Tracy Action. Tracy itself is a eBPF based like runtime analysis tool, and Tracy Action will do baselines, much like what you just saw, but like as a fully fleshed out like idea and thing, and not just like a shitty little script. So, eBPF in general has got me very excited. It's coming to Windows. A lot of the code for the Windows integration is already written and testing has started. So you'll be able to take all of this like Linux garbage if you're one of those people, and you'll be able to do it on Windows like soon enough. When exactly, I don't know. They work on their own time frame, don't they? Brendan, Greg, and Liz Rice, I found to have really, really good eBPF related content. Brendan Gregg is an SRE in Netflix, and he's done a ton of stuff with eBPF and documented it extremely heavily. Pretty much anything you could think of to do, the bones of it are probably there for you to, glue and steal and cut up and do whatever you need to do. Example of that is if we look at IOStat, we can see that we have some devices here, and a couple of them have pretty high disk utilization, right? And some of them don't. But there's not really enough information it's very unclear about like what is making these problems on the system. If you use BioSnoop, an eBPF related tool, then you get extremely detailed information about the specific process that is doing the disk utilization. So your troubleshooting times of any kind of instrumentation-related troubleshooting you want to do go down significantly when you just use eBPF tools all the time. eBPF is used by like top-tier nation states and other people for malware. One I want to tell you a little bit about as we wrap up is called BVP47. And it is a combination of BPF-related malware that is also exploiting a really interesting weakness in TCP handshakes. And I'll dig into that a little bit now for you. So this has been attributed to Equation Group. And how it works is during the initial TCP handshakes, there's not supposed to be any data in the frame, right? It's supposed to just be the SYN and the ACK. Well, you can actually send a data frame. It's just most of the tools on the system won't do anything with that because it's outside of the spec. But if you have BPF malware on a machine, it can read the things that happen outside of the spec and then take actions based upon that. So they developed a command and control system that all it required was to be able to send a SYN packet to a machine. Yeah, pretty fucking cool. So we described before that traditionally when attackers are controlling a system, that the machine that they've compromised, it phones out over the internet or some other protocol to the attacker. And then as they compromise more machines, those machines also phone out to the internet, and then so on. So then you end up, when you've fully rooted a business, you may have lots of outbound connections, maybe not necessarily all at the same time, but you have a very unusual network pattern of behavior. Well, BVPF didn't work that way. It was able to do what's now called beacon chaining, and you can do beacon chaining now in Crowdstrike with some of their stuff, and you can do it in a limited capacity with Sliver, another open source C2 framework. But this was the first example of this, I believe. And it was able to chain together the infections of multiple computers in a network so that as you infected an additional machine, it phoned home via the machine that infected it. So you end up with one network path out of the business, not dozens. It could also switch protocols between the different infections. So you might have an outbound HTTPS connection, but then the infection between machine A and B might be FTP, C and D may be SMB. Because they were using, I think there's two things that make that possible. One of them is the strengths of BPF in terms of reliability and resiliency. And the second one is also they have just amazing confidence in the implants, right? Which one of the reasons why I did this talk and did this research was trying to get more confidence in my implants, that they wouldn't shit the bed and let me down when I really needed them. Because I accidentally copy pasted too much crap in or out of them at once and then they fell over, right? Which they all want to do sometimes. So we're really seeing here that when you pick the right technology to do long-haul C2 things, they just don't die. This person, Hexduck, reconstructed the BVP47 malware in a repo called Triple Cross, which has gotten fuck all attention, and I have no idea why. It's just straight up amazing what they did. It's an undergrad project from someone, I think it's in the University of Mexico. And I mean, it's one of those undergrad projects where you look at it and just being like, people have got PhDs for less. Like, for just like putting out some garbage or whatever. You know, this thing is legit. We've got some code up for this talk on my GitHub. You can go check that out. If you want to go try some of these scripts out for yourself and build these kinds of workflows into your testing. You know, it might help you build your confidence in what you're doing or just understand better about an EDR's fields. Move on to some questions now. Hello, Ryan.
Hello. So when you were talking about the obfuscation and encryption, were you talking about like things like the beacon encryption on sleep, or were you talking about like opening a bunch of files and doing a bunch of badness?
Yeah, I was talking about when you build your implant binary, you have a decision to make of like, how much do you want to do like symbols obfuscation? How much do you want to encrypt or like remove strings from that package? And when you're writing your own stuff on Linux and Mac, my experience so far has been that the less you touch it, the better. Now, obviously, when I do Golang-based C2s and then strip very little out of them, it means that someone can probably trace them back to me personally because of the way that Golang imports software dependencies and shit like that. So I can strip those components out with too much trouble. But that was what I was referring to. The second time I referred to in-memory was to do with like the generation of private keys early on in the process execution, which is something that's like a very common ransomware TTP. And I believe there's been a number of ransomware gangs that have been undone from the reversing of their private keys on the initial execution. Cool. Sure. Hello.
Does the eBPF access require privileged access?
Yes. That's an important thing. eBPF does require privileged access. So if you're going to use eBPF for anything, you will need privileged access. So you won't see eBPF malware as like a first stage, like a payload of compromise. Someone's going to have to do a little work before they can switch to eBPF. Once they switch to eBPF on that system, I would say that you're just 100% boned and you need to get rid of that machine.
I guess the question is for your observability and machine
Yeah.
learning. Do you need root to be able to get the kernel to tell you all that stuff
Yep.
about what Crowdstrike doing or whatever?
Yep. Ed.
So the stuff you did with machine learning, how did you get all that data out of the malware or out of the regular thing that's happening? How'd you extract that into a machine learning model?
So,
Can you repeat for the recording?
yeah.
I'm
So,
trying to figure out how you got the data from, from the actual malware stuff happening, and then it gets put into the whole machine learning model.
yep. So when you write your eBPF program, you write what's called a map. And a map is basically, think of it as like the little database of the information that it collects, that it pushes back to the user space. And then it'll get like written as the CSV. Yeah, cool. Thank you. That was a great question.
Probably said it off that.
Yeah, cool. Hey, man.
Yes, is there any eBPF logging facility? So like, I think of it as a code execution space. Is there any system facility that instruments eBPF activity?
So is your question about whether or not you can trace the things that eBPF does, or is your question about can I use eBPF to trace things on the system?
The former.
Okay. Yeah, there's actually not amazing levels of validation of eBPF modules to like track. It's actually really hard to answer the question as an incident responder, is there an eBPF program even running on this machine right now? That's not the easiest question to answer, especially if your first problem in incident response is identification, then you're going to have a really interesting time answering that question. Without, you have to also have eBPF programs running on that machine to answer that question. If you don't, you're out of luck. Because once you jump on that machine, you're in the user space requesting answers from the kitchen, and the bad guy's in there serving up you whatever he feels like. Yeah. Cool.
Do any of the EDR vendors use eBPF?
Yes. All of the ones that I mentioned use eBPF.
Not Crowdstrike yet.
Yes, they support it on a few kernels.
Oh, they do that now, they came out, okay.
Yeah.
On that note, so you don't technically need root to run eBPF. You have a process that has like, it's called cat. You have a process capability. So technically, like if you're running in a container or something, you could have like this process running there which has cat eBPF and you talk to the kernel with eBPF. But not technically. So there might be a caveat. Universe, as a rule, generally you use root, but theoretically you could have like a lower privilege process that just has that one capability.
Okay. So for the recording, David Mitchell added an addendum that if you're running eBPF inside a container, if it has cap, what was the cap?
BPF.
Cap BPF, then you can run eBPF things without root. Cool. Thank you.
Unlikely, but it's interesting enough.
Okay. He says it's unlikely, but he's probably wrong. It's probably very likely. Yeah. Yeah. No more questions? Please. Okay. That's it. Thank you for your patience.